of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person to embark the gods.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast. Sorry about the audio, let me just fix that. There, that's better. Welcome one and all, welcome Crimson Cloud, Rondon, Alien Honey, great to see you here. I hope we're starting off okay. As some of you watching the video will notice, I've got a bit of a different setup. It's still in developmental stages, and I'm still working on a new background image. So there's that to look forward to. But for now, I thought this might go a little bit better than the bit of a messy background that was there before. However, if you're listening to the audio of this, then you probably won't notice any changes at all. So I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. And what an episode we've got this week! Wow. As always, but it's a good one. And last week we sort of took a bit of a detour from our usual content of following the book, and I felt the need to sort of stress and go into the whole concept of sexual energy, what it is, tantra, etc., etc. And I think it's a very big topic. We obviously didn't cover all of it, but I think we have enough of a basis now to start talking about the other things that we're going to see. Welcome, Neil. Great to have you here as well. So let's get right into it. Now, last week I mentioned very briefly the two civilizations, lost civilizations, Lemuria and Atlantis. And Atlantis is obviously the more famous one, but Lemuria was chronologically first, according to Drunvalo, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what was happening there. We covered a bit of the general story last week in the episode, but we'll go a little bit deeper in for this time around, and there's something we'll actually get into later on in the episode. But for now, let's talk about Lemuria in general. It's a rather curious concept. I can't remember exactly the first time that I heard of it. I think it might have been Drunvalo's book, but I might have heard of it from before. And it's another one of these ideas, like the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, like these ancient civilizations that might have been more advanced than us, and the attempt, or it's sometimes difficult for us to wrap our minds around how can such a different world have existed than what we have been taught. You know, the usual chronological progression of history is that there's lesser advanced civilizations, and they progress over time until we reach who we are today as the sort of pinnacle throughout history. And so the Lemurian civilization was supposedly more advanced than us in a certain aspect. And I think it's important to remember with all of these things that we should be very careful about judging and trying to relate different types, different energies, different types of consciousness, and deciding which is better, because often the case is always about balance and about finding the proper use for each, and when the time and place is right for it. And so, to put it into a little bit clearer terms with an example, in our civilization today, in the modern era, we see a clear inclination and even, a real bias towards intellectualism, towards the rational left hemisphere, cognitive thinking, all of these, logical, robotic, analytical, empirical, all of these cold scientific sort of terms. And it's clear today that those are the ruling thought patterns that we have around us. In an earlier time in history, it seems that quite the opposite was the case, and there was much more adherence to mysticism and spirituality and religion, and these inexplicable forces that were controlling people's lives and demanded our attention much more back then. Things like going to church and praying or wherever, in order to ward off evil spirits or to find, favor in God or whatever it was, and going back even further. So each of these mindsets, if we relate it for a moment to what we spoke about with the sacred geometry and the numbers, if the first mindset is a mindset of not rational thinking but intuitive thinking, meaning more in tune with our, let's say, natural state, and therefore less intellectual, and that is more the state of sort of unity, then the second type of consciousness that we're experiencing now is that of binary, of the sort of separation, the categorization that comes along with empiricism and scientific thought and rational thought. And each of these types of thinking are important and have their place in the universe, along with others. And the idea, I think, in general, and the way I like to live my life, is to find a way to marry these two, supposedly we've been told, opposing ways of thinking, and finding when each of them is actually relevant. And I think with Drunvalo's case, and with a lot of these researchers, Gerald Clark and Sitchin and Michael Tellinger and a lot of others, they have a very strong, keen, rational, scientific mind for trying to deduct and to really investigate and discover the truth. And yet they have a very strong intuition. They follow their gut. They are in tune with their emotions and let them guide and let their, quote unquote, their heart lead rather than their mind. And that, I think, is the kind of balance that can really lead to an understanding and a greater understanding in the universe. So, with that being said, in Drunvalo's words and the way that he phrases it, and again, we're going to remember all of our, the warnings that we stated about classifying as male and female and what we mean by that. But in his words, the Lemurian civilization was a female civilization. So we could say a more intuitive, a more spiritual, a more emotional, etc., etc. And with this, in Drunvalo's words, this civilization was far more advanced than we are today. And so what he says happened was that the human beings who were created by the Nephilim, and with that Thoth agrees with Sitchin's theories, they were taken to this island to develop. And this island is a different island, which we won't get into now, called Gondwana land. Sorry, hard to pronounce. And this was where the humans sort of evolved. And then they were taken, in part, when they were evolved enough that they could help the Nephilim, they were taken to work in the mines and to mine the gold. But some of those people were taken to a different island. And this island was actually the island of Lemuria. And there they were allowed to sort of be free and to advance in their spiritual practices, which is what they were really dedicating themselves to as a species in general. And so they were far more developed spiritually than us, but I would argue that in a way, although this isn't what Drunvalo claims, Drunvalo says that it's they were very much more advanced in both ways than us, but I do think that our civilization has taken that logical scientific method further than the Lemurians or the Atlanteans did. They were more focused on the spiritual, ethereal dimensions and that understanding of the universe. Oh, I can see lots of people joined us. Bleepcoin and Gecko, thank you very much for being here. We're talking about Lemuria. We're getting into it a bit more in this episode, so wonderful to have you. Okay, so what happened as we sped last episode was that these two people, I and Tia were their names, had this act, this tantric act of, interdimensional intercourse, and whatever that may be. As Drunvalo says, there was no physical contact between their bodies. They conceived of a child in that special way, and that made all three of them become immortal. And this was the first time that it had ever happened. These people were obviously very advanced spiritually and were well aware of sort of these practices and what they were doing in their bodies, and their minds were in a very advanced state, let's say. So we shouldn't judge it as just, in comparison to people like us. If we look, for example, at certain stories or, fables or myths or whatever we want to call them in India, for example, where the tantric tradition originally came to us, we can see lots of stories that are very, very similar. In fact, the whole practice of Tantra is based on the fact that you can reach enlightenment, immortality, moksha. All of these things are technically the same through this sexual practice, through the use of this sexual energy in a very specific way, in a very controlled manner. So this idea that might sound very, very bizarre, and we spoke about it a lot last week, can be a lot more, let's say, common among other cultures, and especially among more ancient cultures than we are used to today with our rational, scientific way of looking at the world. So these people, Tia and their son, had gained this knowledge through their practice, and this was the first time that they'd done it, and so they decided to attempt to teach others to do the same in order for other people to become immortals as well. I'm sort of not skipping ahead, but there was a long time passed between the first time that they did it and they actually started to teach. But we're going to skip ahead to when they began teaching, because that's the first point that I want to sort of focus on for a minute. And they actually decided to open a school where they could teach these things to the different people. And in fact, the group of people their first students who studied under them, and them included, were called, and I hope I'm pronouncing this, the Nacaals. I hope that's the correct pronunciation. He says, I would say Macaul because of my English accent, but since it's American, I think it's closer to Nacaal. But nonetheless, Nacaal, if you want to look it up and probably have some pronunciation of it. These people, the students and the teachers, and eventually sort of the practitioners of this spiritual act, were basically the first mystery school that was ever started. And this is a very interesting concept that Drunvalo will actually talk about in many other places, this idea of mystery schools throughout history that have affected humanity and that have been largely responsible for a lot of the events that took place and different people in their lives. So it's a curious subject, and the thing is that for me personally, it was a very big part of my research. Oh, Lemuria is your spiritual home. There's actually a very strong, I completely believe that there's a strong community nowadays of Lemurians, people who, I'll say claim to be descendants, to have a connection, and there's a clear resurgence in that, which is interesting because before that, I think Atlantis was much more common and Lemuria was much lesser known a few decades ago even. But now there seems to be a strong resurgence. There's communities that live as Lemurians. There are people who go to where they claim that Lemuria was and have rituals there. So it's very interesting, and for Atlantis as well. That's I'd love for you to say in chat if you want a little bit about the story. I'm going to continue for now, but I'm reading at the same time. I'll try. So, in my personal journey, with all of this, and the reason I now am doing this podcast and talking to absolute strangers from across the world about, starting from secret, government programs and ancient aliens and all of these things, is it was a long journey until I actually reached that point. And the beginning of it for me was the connection between the economic world that we live in, the economic model that in my mind enslaves humanity in one way or another, and the sort of spiritual side, the energetic, the demonic, as it were, enslavement of humanity, pertaining to all of the historic traditions, good versus evil, and these dark forces lurking in the shadow, etc., etc. And these two worlds seemed very disconnected. And then I finally found this sort of connecting link between it all, and it all clicked, and it was a very momentous period. I was going very deep into a lot of it, and it had to do with these mystery schools. It was in fact more accurately described as secret societies, but the secret societies were the later development of the mystery schools. And as I began retracing the steps both of the economic system and of these sort of stories of mysticism throughout history, I found that these secret societies, just in case nobody knows what I'm talking about, but like the Freemasons or the Golden Dawn or the Theosophical Society, all of these different sort of gatherings of people to practice spiritual secret practices in one way or another, came from the original mystery schools. And as you trace through the different religions and the different cultures, and I think Rondon, if I'm not mistaken, one of the early episodes, you had a picture of all the different religions, and I think all the different mystery schools. There's a picture. Anyway, if you want to look it up, it'll be pretty easy to find. But seeing that at the center of every religion there is this mystery, secret teaching that was definitely, taught and propagated, but in a much more secretive and non-public way. And so the Judaism, for example, has Kabbalah. Christianity has the mysticism of Christianity. I can go through all of it, but basically, if you look through each of these famous religions, that on the surface, when they are taught in sort of public masses to the general public, they're not discussing a lot of these secret truths that they believe in, that they know, but when you look at these texts and you study each of them, they actually agree on a lot of the subject and agree on a lot of the view of the world and how they believe it is. So that whole subject for me was very, very interesting, and retracing it back through each of these grand civilizations. The Greeks, they had the Eleusinians, and I came across that through the use of psychedelics, which was one of the earliest. No one's taught that Socrates and Plato and all of the great Greek thinkers of that time took some form of psychedelic as part of the Eleusinian rituals. In fact, I'd never heard of them until I sort of started researching that. And the Egyptian, ancient Egypt, the civilization obviously had a very famous mystery school. In fact, there were two sort of joined mystery schools called Horus's Left Eye and Horus's Right Eye. And we've mentioned it before, I believe, in one of the episodes in Egypt. We'll talk about it more later. But we're going to go even further back because, as we mentioned, the origin, according to Thoth, according to Drunvalo, of all of these different mystery schools was in Lemuria. That was the first time that they had started a spiritual practice for humanity in general, how to attain enlightenment, how to become immortal through a spiritual practice of one kind or another. And obviously today we can think of many, many more through different cultures. So the importance of this, I think, is very interesting, and it might be a little bit difficult to sort of imagine, but one of the things that was very interesting for me when I was reading about this was that the tarot cards, which are obviously one of the more famous divination techniques certainly today, it's a very mysterious practice. It came apparently from Romani, not really sure where from or who the Romani are originally. But one of the claims, according to Drunvalo and according to Thoth, is that the images and the archetypes on the tarot cards originated from the mystery school in Lemuria, and then from the temple in Atlantis. And so these were the images, these were the sort of archetypal images and concepts that were what those people were meditating on even back then. And it's I think it's very interesting for those who know nothing about the tarot. It's very similar to a lot of what Jung mentions, and obviously he talks about them a lot. It's interesting to learn, not even for the practical side of it, but to be aware of archetypes, the different kinds of consciousness and spiritual journeys and different places on our path. It's all, I think, very, very important and interesting for us to get a clear view of where we are, of who we are, etc. And so to think that those same systems, those same archetypes were around, at least for, some of them for thousands of years, according to mainstream science, and according to Drunvalo, tens of thousands of years. I think it's very interesting to think about where that link leads us, because those people in Lemuria were certainly a lot more in tune with their spiritual side and their spiritual practices than we seem to be today. So just a thought as we go through this, if you can hold that thought in your mind. But nonetheless, we'll continue with our story of Lemuria, and in it, at this point, there's sort of this tragedy to a certain degree, which is that Lemuria sinks. But because they were spiritually aware, and in fact, in Drunvalo's words, psychic, they actually knew that Lemuria was going to sink long ahead of time, and therefore they were able to prepare. Now, from the time they started the mystery school until Lemuria sank, they had managed to teach and elevate, enlighten 333 families of 3. So 1,000 people minus the 1, but we'll round it up, who were all part of this the Nacaal, what Drunvalo calls the Nacaal, this society, this group of people who are elevated spiritually. And these were the people also who knew and sort of were preparing to leave Lemuria before, and so when it sank, they were able to go their separate ways. And he mentions a few places that they lead to, one of them being South America, and it seems that there is a strong connection between an ancient island sinking and various tribes and various cultures around the world, both in South America, in Africa, whose belief and whose origin stories claim that their civilization was started by people coming on boats from somewhere in the ocean. So it's another one of those curious correlations that we seem to come across again and again. And indeed, if you're interested and you've listened this far, Sitchin in his book Ancient Realms, Lost Realms, The Lost Realms, talks about South America and the civilization that came there. And in his words, specifically the civilization that led to the Aztecs were in fact Atlanteans. But Lemuria came first, and some of the people went from Lemuria to a different place, and they could have returned to Atlantis as well. So it's not 100%, but there's certainly interesting correlations there as well. But for our story and where Drunvalo leads us, we spoke in one of the episodes about the polar shifts and how that we're expecting one soon, and the conscious importance, the energetic importance of the polar shift and where we are in regards to that sort of cycle, the precession of the equinox, etc. And when what Drunvalo says here is that the reason, or sort of the time that Lemuria sank, was because there was a polar shift occurring, and in fact this was the cause of Lemuria sinking, and also the cause for Atlantis to start rising. So there's an interesting correlation here again, a sort of coincidence, and Drunvalo mentions it, and I think it's an interesting case that we're talking here. We talked about gods in the last episode, and now we're talking about immortals and all of these concepts of certainly non-human and to some degree sort of elevated beings. And yet, both with the Anunnaki and with Drunvalo and his universe, there is a mention of a sort of even higher force. Now, Drunvalo uses the word God. I think the Sitchin's translation of the Nephilim is creator, the creator of all. But there always is this reference to another sort of being that is the origin, as it were, that is the be all and end all of everything. And so it's curious, but again, in Drunvalo's words, as the Nacaal were gaining more followers and more people were reaching enlightenment, it seems that they were on a straight path to manage to elevate all of the species and the whole human race to become sort of this elevated spiritual being. And yet, according to, as he says, Drunvalo's, according to God's plan, the Creator, this wasn't to be. And it's not stated what the reason is, but we can see this sort of synergy between all of these events if we take it as the story chronologically unfolds, that Lemuria gave us a 1,000 people, a head start, a sort of seed of something, and didn't allow, as it were, or there wasn't time, to continue to convert them all. And then Atlantis came around, and Atlantis was a different story that we'll get into a little bit now. But the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be this grand plan that, although as we always feel that we know what's going on, where we're going, what's going to happen, time and time again we come across struggles and obstacles, and I think maybe this year is certainly a fit example for that, just about for everyone. And it always, I think, for most people, surprises us. It catches us off guard. We never imagine we're going to be the ones in a car accident or whatever it is. And that seems to be I mean, I'm not sure if it's a flaw, but it's definitely something that can sort of hit us when we're down, as it were, add insult to injury, make it even harder to overcome whatever obstacle there is. Whereas the remembrance, and this seems to be part of the power of faith, and part of I mean, in our society it's considered faith. I think for the Nacaals, or for any spiritual being that experiences life, let's say some of these gurus in India who seem or claim to be elevated spiritually, can't experience reality any other way. And so for them, when people come and say, this terrible thing has happened to me, I didn't expect it, I don't know how to deal with it, it's very strange for them to conceive of something happening to me, of something not being part of a much grander scheme, where we are definitely parts and we're the center of our own universe, but nonetheless there's a lot going on all the time. And so I just think that it's an interesting point that Drunvalo mentions here, and feels the need to mention even the word specifically, God with a capital G, that God had other plans, that humanity was not destined to attain enlightenment as a species and to evolve the whole human race together at that point in time, but there was more in store. And as we can see, dozens of thousands of years later again, quite a lot has happened in that time. But nonetheless, as we progress through the story, Atlantis was the beginning of a new civilization. And Atlantis really was something very special, and there's a reason that it was so that it's become so famous today. And in fact, as you look through the historical records and people investigating Atlantis, there seem to be quite a few. I mean, there's a lot of just treasure hunters and adventurers and people who are drawn to any kind of mystery, but there are researchers and geologists and people who really study the science behind it, who have reached some very interesting conclusions and done some research about it. So it's an interesting subject in general. I think much like UFOs or conspiracies, it's easily dismissible, mainly because we have very little contact with it. It's very hard for us to sort of grasp anything about an ancient island that arose suddenly and then sank suddenly and had some civilization on it. But the people who have taken the time to study the texts, I mean, even the way that it's arrived to us, really and truly, one of the few pieces of written, not evidence but history of Atlantis, the mention, is Plato in his, I actually can't remember which book it is, I'm afraid. No, I can't remember. If you want to look it up, it's pretty easy to find. If you write Plato Atlantis, you'll get it. But Plato mentions that his teacher told him about Atlantis, and his teacher learnt it from a priest in Egypt. And so the priest in Egypt, who once again was part of this mystery school, part of this mystery group of people who were privy to this information, was the first mention of Atlantis to a both Western and just modern and outsider of the mystery school. And there seems to be a recurring theme throughout a lot of these mystery practices and historical secret teachings, that there seems to be this sort of case of one person who's privy to the information, who for some reason the god or the hero or whoever it is trusts them and feels the need, sees the urgency in getting this information to later generations. And in fact, speaking of Thoth, this is also a recurring theme that he writes in quite a few places, the need for future generations to read this. The current generations won't understand, and the current generations aren't ready for this information, but in future generations it will become important and apparent. So to think that so much, all of this research and books and people, all of these things started at least with one Greek philosopher, for lack of a better word, who was getting a third-hand story, which was already probably word of mouth for tens of thousands of years. So obviously, unlike Sitchin's research, which is all very much based on hard evidence of the civilization, not necessarily hard evidence of the Anunnaki, but hard evidence of what the civilization who were here believed. With Atlantis, with all of these stories, it's always going to be less scientific, less physical evidence, since no one, to my knowledge, no one has found the actual island of Atlantis yet, but we'll see. In fact, there are a few very interesting theories about it, but we won't get into that now. So, the polar shift basically causes Atlantis to rise from the waters, and the Nacaal decide to move to Atlantis and to restart their civilization, their practice over there. And at this point they do something which is rather interesting, I think. According to Drunvalo, what they do is they begin to envision the island and to plan out the island geographically speaking, or I should say geometrically speaking. And they model the island on the form of the human brain. Now, there are a few pictures that Drunvalo adds of some maps. I don't think they're as crucial, and certainly for people listening, it's not important to actually see them. But if you would like to, you can see different representations, and it'll give you a picture of what the islands look like. But for our purposes, all we need to know is that the Nacaal felt it was necessary to model the island, to model their sort of civilization's place on the human brain. And that means they divided it with one with a wall going down the middle to the length of the island, dividing it to left and right as the two hemispheres, and then another wall dividing it from top to bottom, those making up the four lobes that we have as part of our brain. And this may seem both, as a lot of things, far-fetched and not quite understandable. Why did they feel the need to model, the island after a human brain? But I think, in my mind at least, this is again an example of form and function, which comes up time and time again because it's a core issue with spirituality. And indeed, this idea of form and function is one of the most prevalent and easiest to spot tendencies of these mystery schools and of these secret societies. All secret societies that I've come across, at least, have a great importance of symbolism, a great need for the use of symbols to represent secret, hidden truths and spiritual understandings. And the reason for this is that at the bottom of all of these symbols and all of this spiritual practice is the, I don't know what to call it, theory or worldview of sacred geometry. That is not a question of sort of defining it in one way or another, but sacred geometry is a part of this this reality. And so when it comes to things like spiritual practices, and these are not all spiritual practices, but I'm talking about these secret societies and the ones that have been sort of around for hundreds of years, they all have a connection to this sacred geometry perception of reality. And so when we come to judge or to look at any of these places, it's interesting. This is one of the first things I think that I sort of came across. You start noticing it in so many of the things, even the Freemasons logo, as it were, which was rather ridiculous. Not ridiculous, but just I didn't understand what it was for many years. Once I studied a bit more about the concepts and understood it more, it became much clearer what the symbol means and represents. And there's a lot of videos out there, and I think that there are a few also that are inaccurate. Some people take it a little too far, but there are definitely a lot of good examples of both companies and, you know, certain wealthy families and all of these different symbols having a meaning that is also entrenched in sacred geometry. ALX, thank you very much for joining. I'd love to hear a little more about your thoughts that it's simplistic. I'm just going to carry on while you type, but please do, because we're coming up to the end, so we'll have some time anyway. So the Nacaal decided to construct the island in the shape or in the model of the human brain, because they saw the significance of the physical, geographical, location and attributes of the island having a direct correlation to their both spiritual and physical body, for that matter. And the importance of this was, in their mind, the effect that it will have on the people who are living in that society. And this idea, in some ways, is similar to the idea of Feng Shui, which there are many different variations of this in different cultures, but Feng Shui, I think, is the most famous. Feng Shui literally, I think, translates as water-air or water-wind. And these are sort of the two energies that move through any space, and these are the energies that you need to sort of pay attention to and to guide or allow in order to have the healthiest, as it were, space. And so the idea that the energy and the energetic imprint of a geographic location, which is partly decided based on structure and the different attributes, is definitely an important factor for them and for these people. Okay. Oh, nice. I only read your comment and I didn't see the picture until I came in. Yeah, there's a lot going on over there. I'm not going to go into any of the visual images, it's just because some people are listening to the audio, and I'm definitely not proficient in actually recognizing any of them. I really suggest for you, if you haven't done it before, to look into it and to see the different shapes, symbols, all of these relations to sacred geometry. It's just a very interesting way of seeing how it is expressed. Okay, so I think that's probably a good place to stop. Okay, yeah. So just one more sentence, and then that will be where we'll take a break for now. So we said they divided the island into the four lobes, top to bottom, left to right, and then in the middle, as it were, of that area, they actually built a physical wall. and to Drunvalo's words, the wall was sort of, you couldn't get across. They really divided the people who were living in each part, and in order to get across, you literally had to go, into the water around the island. And the way that it was divided, there were actually other islands that were sort of lower down that were part of this, but this was the mainland where the Nacaal were actually living, just that civilization. And in that division of the wall, they actually divided the people into male and female attributes. Now again, this wasn't men and women, this wasn't the gender based, but it was, as it were, energetically based. The people who were more connected to the female or to the masculine decided to take that route, as it were, and to function in this quote-unquote brain under that. And 3 people of those were elected to function as the corpus callosum. For those who don't know, the corpus callosum, I'm pretty sure we mentioned it as well, is the middle part that connects the 2 hemispheres left and right together and allows basically the communication between them. So there were 3 people who were designated, as it were, to function as the corpus callosum of this brain, and they were allowed to go anywhere they wanted, according to him. So the other people were sort of confined to a certain degree in the designated hemisphere, whether it was male or female. So that's what we have at this point. Now, this might be a little bit of an odd place to stop for this week, but next week we're going to be carrying on with the story a little bit further. Alex, ALX, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you want to elaborate a little bit more. But I would like to say something before we move forward, and we're coming up to the end. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. That for a long time, I actually spent most of my arguments saying that it's all geometry. Basically, when you get down to it, when you really boil it down to what it is, it's all about geometry. Not sacred geometry, just geometry, form, and the function, and the categorization, and the all of the rest of it is derived out of that initial form, from molecules to humans to galaxies, etc. Now, I don't think that that's the only way to view the world, definitely, but it does seem to be a more fundamental one than language-based ideas, theories, concepts. All of the different ways that we talk about the world, a lot of the time they are lacking that physical representation, that physical connection with reality, which obviously geometry is. Geometry, as I in the first time I spoke about it mentioned, geometry isn't a language like the other languages because it doesn't use symbolism. It is what its symbols are. They are literally geometric, as it were. And so that's why geometry is unique in that sense among most languages. I bet there are other languages that would be, but I can't think of any right now. But certainly all of the languages that we know as encoding information all need symbolism of one way or another in order to encode it. They can't actually be the encoders except for the physical reality that we see, which is shapes and forms. DNA is not just a sequence of letters that are printed. It's a sequence of shapes of proteins that are in a certain sequence that derive a certain shape, and that shape is the encoding of the information itself. So we've spoken about it before, but I just wanted to reiterate when we talk about it here that the example of the Nacaals deciding to form this human brain is for them, where they are acting from. As Drunvalo says, it probably would look rather strange to us if we saw them doing this, but the spiritual understanding that they had saw that there is a clear relationship between the way they live their lives and even the location that they are, and their spiritual practices, their civilizations, consciousness as a whole. and it can be affected by this behavior. And for me personally, I feel a strong resonance to this idea. I have many sacred buildings that I look forward to building one day in the in the eco-village, but I definitely feel that the environment that you live in, and indeed the way that you live. So I'll give us a small example here because we're slightly off topic, but I think it is related. When we decide, for example, to go to work and to spend that time in the commute, we are spending a certain amount of the day sitting inside the car. So we're detached to a certain degree from the outside world, and we are going through it at a much higher speed. If we contrast that to walking to work, whatever that may be, but the actual act of walking versus the act of driving is very, very different, and it will affect not only the actual journey, but indeed our state of consciousness when we get to that place. Now, this might seem all very, very simple and obvious, I hope, because that's my point. The second step to that would be to say that yes, our environment as a whole is constantly affecting us, and the fact that we live in square buildings has an effect on the energy inside and on our consciousness. The fact that we walk on flat surfaces with very little to no bumps. I'm talking about we as a general we, but I'm saying modern society has decided that the best way to walk is with flat surfaces, and the way to go up an inclination is with stairs or with a lift. All of these ideas that seem very common and very obvious to us, that obviously modernity and the comfort that it affords are what we desire, are the best thing, are the healthiest thing for us. These are all assumptions and worldviews, and I think it's good for us to hear about these stories and think about this different way of living our lives, that the way I sit and slouch in my chair, or the way I pick up toys, or the way I walk has an effect. And indeed literally the place that I walk in, whether I cross a garden or whether I live in a right hemisphere of a brain, or whatever the circumstances, they all have an effect on my psyche, on myself, and my consciousness. So that's it. I just wanted to give that short idea out there. It's a subject that I feel very, very strongly about. I unfortunately don't know enough about it. I am very interested in Feng Shui. I can't say that I've studied it very closely, but for a while I sort of dabbled in it a bit, and it's a very curious way of looking at the world. We often look at the world through the various empirical measurements that we can sort of have access to, the temperature of a room, the colors on the wall, how soundproof it is. These are the elements that will decide whether we buy a house, and there is that thought of airflow through the place, but we don't consider energy flow. There's no concept of that. No realtor in the West talks about it, and yet in China, and I'm sure in other places as well, this is the most common practice. This is obviously part of what you talk about when you talk about the architecture or the place, where it is, etc., etc. And in past, obviously, they would pay a lot of money for an expert on Feng Shui to come and say what it is that should be done, as it were, or what's the most energetic place that we can put whatever it is that we're trying to put, etc., etc. So it's an interesting concept that I feel are very far from. And I hate brutalist architecture. Where is yes, it really is all over the world. That's why for us, in fact, for my wife and I in the eco village, a big part of it is both building our own house, designing our own house, and for us, we also want to have a round house. Being able to consider these things, to take them into account, and to decide what we want and how we want to do it, and also having the community of people, having the eco-village members come and take part in the building process, and to help work on the project, because the people in the community are also the ones who enjoy or suffer the presence of a house, whether it's something pretty to look at, or I'm sure I have walked next to the famous eyesore of a house that the rich person could afford, or whatever they did that was out, stood out in the neighborhood, or whatever. There's always these stories of sort of that neighbor who ruined it for everyone with the house that they built, the extension they made, the swimming pool they put in. And I think we can partly, obviously not fix everything, but we've lost that connection that community has with the houses that make up the space that we live in. Who has taken part in designing our environment. Even if we design the interior of the house, or even the house itself, very few of us have the opportunity to have any say in the environment around us. And for that reason, I think, at least partly, we really didn't consider it. Don't think of it as a loss in any way. It's why not? I have no reason to get involved. I have no concern about how it's designed, but it might have an effect that is greater than we think, and it might be an interesting experiment. I intend to find out, so stick with me, and in the future I'm sure we'll have the results of just how important or unimportant it is for us. No, I'm joking, but I do think it's an interesting subject to consider, especially for us who are very disconnected with all of that and really don't see importance. When we were looking for a house to rent in Jerusalem, I remember we saw some incredible places, a house, not a house, but an apartment with no windows, which you really think, how can you design a house? How can you think about making it's a box? That's not a house. It's not an apartment. It's not a place that you can live. No, I'm being very judgmental, but I think that nobody would choose, to live in a house with no windows, or an apartment. Or there were different places that were just they had some where the window just opened out to the opposite wall of the building, so you had a window with a wall in front of it, and that's just such an odd choice to make as an architect, as a designer. It really baffled me at the time. So it's sorry, it's something that I probably spent far too long babbling about, but it's an interesting concept, I think. Anyway, what time is it? Okay, we've got 5 more minutes. Excellent. Do we have post up? Is it post up? Yes, post up. Do we have post up after this, Rondon? If you know if they're on. Mariano, I didn't see you. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining. I didn't see that you were here. Yes, so let me know what you think about Lemuria and Atlantis, if you've heard of anything. But it's sort of a curious subject, I think. It's interesting to see what different people have to say. Yes, I'm lucky that I had my first episode last week. We managed to get past the time change. So yeah, there's no post up today, so you'll have to wait for Crimson Clad, right? Crimson Clad, you have a show later? Yeah, we'll see if that's happening later on. But for now, let's see. Okay. Yeah, so the subject of Lemuria, Atlantis are just, I think something that a lot of people have heard about, but not really sure what exactly it was or what we think about it. We'll get into it more. So Krim has, excellent, a a show today. Fire and Rebellion for the 5th of November. Of course. Fixed. Nice. Yes. Happy Guy Fawkes Day today. That's an interesting one as well. Oh, shame I didn't remember it before. It's Wait, Krim, are you from England, or do you just know about the 5th of November because it's now a famous subject around the world? For those who don't know, the 5th of November is commemorating Guy Fawkes, who was an English, a freedom fighter and terrorist, depending on which side of the fence you are, who planned an attack on Parliament that failed. But if you've seen the anonymous masks in any of the protests around the world become very famous, then those are Guy Fawkes masked, supposedly modeled after him, but I actually haven't seen a picture of him. Is that really what he looked like? I don't know. Anyway, so the Guy Fawkes character, which was it's just an interesting one, a failed terrorist, as it were. He was remembered at the time as someone who didn't manage to carry out the plot, but he's seen such a resurgence in these days. So I'm surprised, Krim. How did you hear of the 5th of November? Is it also through what's it called? What's that film? V for Vendetta. That's the one. That I think was also one of the things to bring it to famousness. Wait, can you hear me in the stream? Is it all running? Are we okay? I can't tell. Okay, well, let me know if you can hear me, and if you can't hear me, then I'll assume you don't know. Oh. But that everything seems to be... nice. Okay. I wasn't sure. I'll have to have a look at that gecko after the show. There are lots. I can't remember exactly their name. There's a few around the world, I think, but there is a community of people who are now trying to live their life as Lemurians, or I'm not saying that they're not claiming to live as Lemurians. In fact, there are many of those sort of ancient civilizations that people are now trying to base their lives on and live like. It's interesting. I personally I can't really relate because I've had very little personal experience of one kind or another to lead me down that path, unfortunately, or whatever it is, but that's the case. So I've remained over the years much more interested in collecting as many of these different practices as possible and trying to sort of put them together and mix and match and find what works for me. And I think that's what I think people of today should be free to do, to be able to dip their toe, to taste, to see whatever they want to, and to then decide what for them is important and what they feel connected to, and what they don't want to have. And I think that would be a wonderful world for all of us to live in. Okay, I think that's the end. Yes, I hope you heard as much of that as you could. I've been Lev. It's been a pleasure, and I'll see you all for next week. Until then, have a good one.